Welcome to the Abridged Presidential Histories with Kenny Ryan, episode 28D, an interview on Woodrow Wilson, World War I, and shaping a new world order with Thomas Knock. I'm excited to welcome Thomas Knock to the show today. Tom is both chair of the Department of History and a distinguished fellow at the Center of Presidential History at Southern Methodist University, a university where I once worked and got my MBA. He is also a board member of the Wilson Presidential Library, and he wrote the prize-winning book To End All Wars, Woodrow Wilson and the Quest for a New World Order. And that's where we're going to focus our time today. Tom, thank you so much for your time.
Glad to be here, Kenny.
Before we jump into World War I, what would you want someone to know about Woodrow Wilson to help contextualize this story?
Well, it's interesting. Wilson is not very fondly remembered or well understood by most Americans, certainly not these days, but he occupies a secure position in that exclusive pantheon of great presidents. The domestic legislation he signed into law and the new directions he charted in American foreign policy really, during the First World War, really shaped the future politics and foreign policy of the United States throughout the entire 20th century. And into our own time, I would say. Among all presidents, only Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson have matched Wilson's record, for instance, in enacting a significant legislative program. Early on in his presidency, he established the Federal Reserve System, Federal Trade Commission. He signed into law the first federal law that gave the 8-hour day to American railroad workers that overnight, about 400,000 workers got the 8-hour day, the first federal law to restrict child labor. Those are all really, really major achievements on his part. And then in the realm of international relations, I don't think any chief executive has ever communicated more effectively to the peoples of the world the ideals of democracy, or through the Covenant of the League of Nations, came up with a more original idea for reducing the risk of war than Wilson. Those are really two sides of the presidency, domestic and foreign policy, and pretty significant things there.
And that's like a lot. I mean, he's obviously a very busy guy, and it's kind of funny that he was doing all that. Oh, yeah, and World War I happens on his watch.
That's
so,
right.
You know, he's about 2 years into his presidency. Very busy, getting all that stuff done. When, in the span of roughly a week, all of Europe's mightiest powers declare war on each other, kicking off World War I. What was Wilson's initial reaction to this outbreak of war?
Well, you know, August 1914, there's no one living in the world who could have imagined a spectacle as violent and complicated as this. The casualty statistics are just absolutely stunning. If you look at what happened to France in just 1 year, 1915, over 300,000 French soldiers were killed. That's close to all the Americans killed in World War II, and that's just 1 year for France. 1.4 million French dead at the end of World War I. For the United Kingdom, 900,000 killed, which is 2.5 times the number of people from the United Kingdom killed during World War II. So we're talking about a conflict that really strained human comprehension for this insensate slaughter. And Americans really thanked God for the Atlantic Ocean at that time, because 3,000 miles of open sea was quite a barrier at the time. For Wilson, you know, that particular week in August, it's interesting you put it that way. He went through two of the most rending experiences of his life. His wife, Ellen, whom he dearly loved, had 3 daughters with. They were married for 29 years, lay dying. She had tuberculosis of the kidneys, and she perished on August 6th as the rollout for the war was occurring. But I must say that Wilson declared neutrality within about 24 hours of the full onslaught of the war. So most Americans, it gets to the question of neutrality, which I think is what you're getting at, and why. I remember when I was studying this in high school, about American neutrality, that we're always pro-British, that sort of thing. But that's worn a little bit thin in recent years. If you think about why we were neutrality, again, geography is very, very important, 3,000 miles away.
Hmm.
Um, there's also a tradition of non-involvement in European affairs. Not many people understood and wouldn't understand for a while the causes of this conflict, too. But probably most important, interesting enough, the nature of American society is what kept the United States out of the war for as long as it stayed out. A full third of the population of the United States in 1914 were immigrants and their children, recent immigrants from the so-called new immigration that began in the 1890s and came to a halt in 1914. And then in addition to them, think about what the other two largest so-called ethnic groups would have been. That would be German Americans and Irish Americans. They were not going to want to go to war very quickly to bail out Great Britain. So you see what I'm getting at. The diversity of the American population is pretty much what kept the U.S. out of the war from a political and social standpoint, if you follow me on that.
Yeah, and I'm curious, was there any debate about that? Like when Wilson's sitting there now, obviously his wife's dying. There's a lot going on his mind. But when he hears these reports of wars, is there like a cabinet debate of what do we do? Or is it just an automatic, oh, we're neutral? Like we all know
Well,
we're going to be neutral here.
yes, but he does certainly consult with his cabinet on this. But if anybody said let's go to war, I mean, who would they go to war against at that
Yeah,
point? So neutrality was a natural first position to take. What's miraculous when you consider that the world's greatest power were in the throes of the world's greatest conflict to that point, that the United States was able to stay out of it. It was the world's greatest economy. It was not the world's greatest military power. The potential was definitely there,
yeah,
but it was a huge factor for both warring coalitions. And staying out of it was not an easy thing. You had the British blockade, for instance, almost from the
right.
beginning,
Yeah,
which caused a lot of problems in Anglo-American relations because the British started stopping American ships on the high seas, ostensibly to seize contraband. They would seize American mail. Um, Relations over those issues really got pretty tense. By the time you get to like 1916 or so, British American relations are the worst they've been since the War of 1812, really. And then, of course, in the beginning of February 1915 is when the Germans retaliated against the British blockade. You have to keep in mind that the British had the greatest navy in the world. They had the advantage on the high seas, and they could cut Germany, all the Central Powers, off from trade with big neutrals like the U.S. The Germans had the advantage on the continent, incidentally. They had the greatest army and
right.
facilities there. But in any case, they launched the submarine in February of 1915, which could potentially endanger American lives and property, which of course it did in the biggest way early on with the sinking of the Lusitania in May of 1915. Um, about 1,200 people drowned on the Lusitania, including about 120 Americans. And Germany pretty much forfeited the struggle for public opinion with the sinking of the Lusitania because it seemed like wanton murder of civilians on the high seas. And so that's a very, very difficult issue to deal with. There were lesser incidents going on into 1915 and 16, but we certainly didn't go to war over the Lusitania. Nobody
Right.
wanted to do that. Americans wanted Wilson to keep his head and save us from this mess. There was another big crisis in the spring of 1916 over a ship, the Sussex, that the Germans torpedoed, and some Americans were killed, and in part because you have a coming political campaign. Wilson felt the necessity to really draw the line on this and insist that Germany not end but curb submarine warfare and observe what was called the rules of visit and search. That is to say, you would halt a ship, allow the passengers and crew to get in lifeboats, and then you'd sink it. that sounds good from our perspective, but if you were a German submarine commander,
Yeah.
there was nothing keeping, say, a British merchantman
Yeah.
equipped with a cannon of some sort that was covered with
Yeah.
a tarpaulin. And once a submarine surfaces, it's pretty vulnerable. Um, in any case, they kept to the so-called Sussex Pledge for almost a year. And from that point in the spring of 1916 onward, um, U.S.-German relations were pretty steady. They were smoother than they were for the U.S. with the British. And they managed to sink a fair number of ships by observing, visit, and search. And Wilson, of course, not only because of that, but he was able to run on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," which he did.
Yeah.
It's interesting. The main reason Germany went along with this, though, was because they only had about 20 or 25 submarines at that
Ah.
point, which was a fair number. But it wasn't really enough to tip the balance in the war to their favor, but it was quite enough, potentially, to provoke the world's most powerful neutral
Yeah.
um, to declare war on them, and that would spell disaster potentially for Germany. So they held off for a while, and in any case, it had a big impact on American domestic politics.
So we start off Americans pretty much universally want to stay out of it. I mean, even guys like Theodore Roosevelt are like, well, maybe even we should side with Germany. Some people are saying, but you have the submarine warfare ramping up pressure to do something about Germany.
Yes.
You have British blockade also complicating relationships. What are the big factors that really pushed Wilson toward? Like, what were the factors that were still holding him up, and what were the ones that pushed him over the top?
Well, the things that were holding him up, if you're talking about getting into the war, was the fact that Germany was curbing its submarines, and he was trying to mediate an end to the war. Um, he ran for reelection not just on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," but also because the League of Nations entered American politics in 1916. It was a factor in the campaign for reelection. Wilson was supposed to lose that election. His election in 1912 was a fluke
Yeah.
because the
Yeah.
Republicans were split
Yep.
wide open between Taft and Roosevelt. By now, they had patched things up. But because Wilson had become such a thoroughgoing progressive, Federal Reserve, Federal Trade Commission, the Adamson Act, the child labor law, the appointment of Louis Brandeis, he was able to pull over to the normal Democratic vote probably at least a third of the people who voted for Theodore Roosevelt in 1912 on the
Mm-hmm.
progressive ticket.
Yeah.
And it's estimated that probably, I don't know, 35 or 40% of the people who voted for Eugene Debs in 1912 came
Wow.
over to Wilson.
Yeah.
And so that swelled the normal Democratic vote. So he won on a kind of a platform of progressivism and peace. He knew quite well that at any moment, a submarine commander could plunge the U.S. Into war the next day if it violated the Sussex Pledge. And so he became almost desperate to try to end the war before something like that happened. And in January of 1917, he went before the Senate and he made a very, very important speech, one of the two or three most important he ever did. It's called the Peace Without Victory speech. And he appealed to the belligerents to cease the war before um, an injury be done civilization that could never be atoned for or repaired. And to what he launched a kind of critique of European imperialism, um, uh, uh, militarism, balance of power politics, those things, and held out the idea of what you could call a new world order based on new rules of international life that would have a capstone in the League of Nations, wherein nations, rather than going to war, would agree to submit disputes between them to an international court of arbitration, that they would work together to build down their armaments. So you have a serious reduction in arms and begin to roll back colonialism in favor of self-determination, those kinds of things. And he was hailed by liberals on the left all over the world. But at just that time, in January of 1917, there's a big struggle going on in the German high command over reverting now, since they had built up their fleet of submarines by this point over the previous months, to about 100. reasoning that if they went for all-out, unrestricted submarine warfare against all flags, that they could bring the belligerents to their knees before the United States, which was sure to declare war on that account,
Hmm.
get its act together to bring sufficient force to Europe to tip the balance against Germany. It was a huge gamble. It's
Yeah.
one of the biggest gambles in history. And so on February 1st, they resumed, or not resumed, they reverted to full scale unrestricted submarine warfare. And even that didn't cause Wilson to go to Congress to ask for a declaration of war. We didn't, that's not until early April. So you got February and March to see what's going to happen. And they do begin to sink American ships without warning. And then you have something called the Zimmerman Note that you probably know something about,
Yep.
wherein the Germans rather stupidly um, tried to inveigle Mexico to attack the United States in the event of war between the U.S. and Germany, with the reward of trying to get Texas back for Germany and California, that sort of thing. And that the British had interdicted this correspondence between the Germans and the Mexicans. I forget, sometime in February, and they held on to it at a particular a period of time to release it at a at a particularly good moment in U.S.-German relations, and it had its desired propagandistic effect. I mean, it was a
Yeah.
ridiculous, preposterous proposition, but it's one of the things that caused Wilson to lose faith in the good offices of the Germans to sort of plot with Germany that way.
Yeah.
Neither side was responding to Wilson's interposition to come to the peace table or anything like that. So I think basically the combination of the resumption of, again, the reversion to unrestricted submarine warfare, the idea in Wilson's mind that the war was probably coming to an end and American belligerency would hasten its end.
Hmm. Hmm.
If the U.S. got into the war, which it seemed probably at this point in his mind it was going to happen sooner or later, better to have it happen sooner, that perhaps American participation could turn it toward a better outcome than might otherwise obtain. And when he went before Congress to ask for a declaration of war, he laid out, basically kind of peace without victory platform
Yeah.
for democracy, for the rights and liberties of small nations, and for what he called a universal dominion of right by such a concert of free peoples as shall make all nations free, and those kinds of lines of rhetoric that bring us to that, in part to that line, the world must be made safe for democracy. It
Yeah.
was a brilliant speech. Some observers compared it to Henry V, the St. Crispian's Day speech of Henry V before.
You talk about it, the submarines, the Zimmerman telegraph. I mean, these are all reasons that are getting people in it. But then Wilson goes into that speech, and he has that rhetoric, he has that line: "The world must be safe for democracy." And this is what we read in all our textbooks. Every American student coming up hears that line. Did the line land as impactfully back then as it does today? Did Americans feel like we're entering a crusade for democracy?
That is not what Wilson said.
Oh,
This is well, think he's a rhetorician.
yeah,
You've got Thomas Jefferson, you've got Abraham Lincoln, you have Woodrow Wilson, and one or two other presidents who are brilliant rhetoricians, wordsmiths.
yeah,
He uses the passive voice. He says, the world must be made safe for democracy.
yeah,
Think about that. In other words, it has to be made safe enough for our democracy. And that's going to require the military defeat of Germany
right.
because it poses a threat to that. He did not mean it to be a crusade for democracy, and
Okay.
that's a misinterpretation. Most people don't really realize that, and most scholars debate this issue.
How did the American people take it?
That in one way or another, it is a war for democracy, but not
Yeah.
necessarily, imposing our ways on other peoples, because
Got it.
it works with the idea of self-determination too.
Right,
That's
right,
a
right.
big issue in all of this as well. And so that's an interesting thing about his most famous phrase of his presidency. It's in the passive voice.
Yeah.
But he's talking about we shall fight for the things that are nearest our hearts, and so that we can at least pursue our own experiment in peace and safety, and maybe others might want to emulate us.
Awesome, awesome. And he of course mentions the other thing. He mentions submarines, mentions Zimmerman, and then he hits the rhetoric, to really get your heart
Of
involved,
course,
Yeah.
of course.
So one thing that also strikes me at Wilson is, famously at one point he tells an associate roughly that it would be a shame if he became a war president because his life experience had really prepared him for domestic affairs. But I also kind of find that funny because despite that, he seems to have like a really clear idea of what he wanted the New World Order to look like when he entered the war. He had the 14 points. Sounds like he might talk about sooner. So was this something Wilson had been carrying around, or when did he develop it?
Because he had 2.5 years to think about it. He was able to keep the U.S. out of the war for 30 months. That's a long time. And believe me, the issue coursed through American politics. And you have an internationalist movement crop up in American politics. It's with two wings, basically, a progressive wing and a more conservative wing. Wilson's chief critics, like Henry Cabot Lodge, for instance, none of them were really isolationists. They were internationalists also, but more conservative sort. But one thing about what he actually said, he said it to a friend before he was inaugurated. He said he used another great phrase. It would be the irony of fate. That's what he said. It would be the irony of fate if my administration had to deal chiefly with foreign policy.
Right.
Not if he would be a war president, but nonetheless foreign policy. And the first big, military struggle of sorts that he dealt with was the Mexican Revolution on the border, which was going haywire when a military dictatorship came to power after 2 years of revolutionary ferment. But in any case, so that's the full context for that. But he developed a full platform. That's why I wanted to bring in the Peace Without Victory formula, which was a culmination of his thinking during the war about the causes of the war and what could be done, not to eliminate war. It's impossible to do that, I suppose, but to lessen the likelihood of it. And to what he emphasized more than anything else was to head war off before it started. Not collective security was part of it, but to set in motion processes for the peaceful settlement of international disputes, along with building down armaments, because one of the causes of the war probably was this huge arms race among the European great powers in the context of imperial rivalries and tremendous surges of nationalism in at least a couple of the belligerent countries, very unstable political circumstances in Germany and Russia. And it's said that the old regimes there seized upon that crisis in the Balkans and rushed to war in order to prop up their own regimes, basically, and put people around the flag. Socialists, the biggest socialist party in the world was in Germany, and it was a social democracy in Germany, and they voted war credits right away because, they feared the Russians, that kind of thing. So by the time you do get to the time of the 14 points, he does have a full raft of ideas, and with a following too. A lot of when he got endorsements from liberal magazines like the New Republic, they all pointed to his thoroughgoing progressivism. They also pointed out that he's not only keeping us out of war, he has a plan to at least try to avoid wars like this in the future. And lots of people joined. They might have been progressive Republicans and are now happy to join Wilson to keep him in office for those reasons. And he was sincere in this, and they took him seriously, too.
I'm curious, would you mind elaborating on what his vision was for the world order? Because I think it's very easy to remember what we ended up getting and to lose what the vision was. Like, how would you succinctly sum up what he wanted?
Well, basically, with the 14 points themselves, more than half of them pertain to territorial arrangements. About half a dozen of them pertain to things other than that. One thing that we should really talk about, though, for context for the 14 points, and it has a lot to do with the League of Nations, is the fact of the Russian Revolution.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
No Russian Revolution, probably no 14 points address.
Ah.
Because here's the thing, you had,
Yeah.
right as we're entering the war in
Yeah.
April of 1917, the first Russian Revolution, led by Alexander Kerensky and Social Democrats, come to power. They overthrow the czarist regime, and their big mistake is that they recommit to the war.
Yeah. Bad idea. Bad
No,
idea.
no country suffered more than Russia during World War One or World War Two, as you
Yep.
probably know.
Yeah.
It just battered. And the Bolsheviks came to power in November of 1917, just a few months after the provisional government under Kerensky got set up, which the U.S. was the first great power to recognize. That also, incidentally, made it easier for Wilson to couch our entrance into the war under the word of democracy, because the Russians were no longer this horrible backward autocracy. There was an ostensible democratic socialist government in power by March, April 1917. Here comes the Bolsheviks, though, promising peace and bread.
Yeah.
And they succeeded in overthrowing the previous regime, and they began to pull Russia out of the war. And at the same time, they published allied treaties among the allied powers for parceling out the territorial swag at the end of the war, to tell the lie on the
Territorial
so-called,
swag. I love it.
yeah, to tell the lie on the so-called virtues of the war. So here's an ideological problem here for Wilson, because he just finally got into it after 2.5 years, and he is invoking democracy and self-determination. And our allies might have some issues with those very issues himself. The other thing is, it creates a military crisis. When Russia pulls out of the war, that allows Germany to move some 40 divisions to the Western Front. A division, depending on what country's army you're talking about, is anywhere between 10,000 to 12,000 troops, times 40, back to the Western Front. And they almost won the war because of that. So it's a military and ideological crisis that falls to Wilson to reassure liberals and socialists in all the Allied countries that the war is worth fighting to the very end. And so the 14 points is a kind of response to the Bolsheviks, who have tried to tell what the lie is about the Allied cause. And it talks about open covenants, openly arrived at, and reduction of armaments to the lowest point consistent with domestic safety, the impartial adjustment of all colonial claims. That appeals to everybody, too. National self-determination and the League of Nations, the 14th point. That's the most important one for him. And what else? He has nice things to say about the Russian people, that they should have a clear, the other nations should not interfere with them working out their own destiny. He calls for the return of Alsace-Lorraine to the French, a free and independent Poland. Those kinds of things are all part of the 14 points. It embodied new ideas and new ways of thinking about what an international community in the 20th century might achieve in the wake of this unparalleled catastrophe born of the 19th century, really, in many respects.
So in early 1918, Wilson puts out his 14 points, and people have already heard for a while too, like what this guy's about. They know what he's about. Almost a year later, November 11th, 1918, the armistice that ended World War I takes hold, and then the peace negotiations began. What was Wilson's goal and strategy in those negotiations? Was he still after the 14 points, or had he evolved on anything?
Well, the Germans, when finally their lines are beginning to fall back in September and October toward the Belgian frontier, they know the jig is up.
Yeah.
And they pursue not the British or the French, but they pursue Wilson.
Ah.
They ask him to take steps to bring about an armistice on the basis of his 14 points address. It's a good move on their part. And some historians have maintained that probably the 14 points address maybe shortened the war some, because millions of copies of it were dropped over German lines and things like that, and also in Russia to the Russians up to 14 points. It was great propaganda, really. But in any case, so the terms of the armistice were settled militarily, but also there's a quasi acceptance on the part of the Allies of the 14 points, but not fully, because both the French and the British have certain exceptions to it. And, Victorio Orlando made that, or not Orlando, but Clemenceau made that famous remark. He said, God gave us the 10 Commandments and we broke them. Wilson gives us the 14 points. We shall see. And they were antagonists. But in any case, you have pretty acrimonious negotiations for about 6 months. What Wilson wanted to try to do anyhow, getting the League accepted by the Allies was his number one goal, and he got that pretty early on. But what he wanted to do was to moderate some of the more extreme territorial aims of the Allies and other punitive demands against Germany. And he often found himself in a minority of one, and was often, compelled to compromise his principles. And he was also not very well then, and basically permitted, there's not much he could do in certain circumstances, but permit the Allies to impose on Germany a huge reparations burden, as well as a war guilt clause saddling Germany with the moral responsibility for having started the war. His one hope, though, was, even with its flaws, the Treaty of Versailles contained the Covenant of the League of Nations, and that would be able to rectify the injustices contained in the Treaty of Versailles itself. And Wilson thought that it would create kind of at least a temporary shelter from the storm for a few years to give the nations the opportunity to experiment, to see if these ideas of arbitrating disputes, reducing arms, and so on stood a chance of acceptance in international relations.
One thing that is rattling in my mind, so I feel like I got to say it out loud, is someday I want to contrast the 14 points of World War I versus the unconditional surrender of World War II. And the impact those had on both elongating or shortening their wars and the world orders that came after them.
You want me to?
Yeah, if you have a thought on that, I'd love your thought.
Germany was not invaded at the end of World War One. And they fell back and they fell into revolution pretty quickly. Also, the idea was to end the war as soon as you could, and the Allies wanted to do that. Here's an interesting statistic for you. For every combat death for the Americans, which was about 52,000, it wasn't that many, more died of the flu, about 110,000 altogether. About half of that were battle deaths, and half of that number was in September of 1918. But for every one of our guys, a total of 47 Brits and French soldiers died. And so they didn't want to drag this out anymore than they had to. The issue with unconditional surrender, that is really tied intimately with the decisions to drop the bombs on Japan, the atomic bombs. So probably don't have time to go into that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your thoughts on that. Okay, so back to
But the completeness of the victory, otherwise, Germany turned over all kinds of artillery, and ships and so on. When Wilson went before Congress to read out the terms of the armistice, people gasped audibly over the completeness of the victory. Really, it was a peace with victory, hoping for the peace without victory ideas to come through in the end. The pity for Wilson, though, was that the midterm elections of 1918 shaped the politics and diplomacy thereafter, because after 6 years of Democratic majorities, reversal of fortunes there, he lost both houses, the Senate by just 2. It's interesting how close some of those Senate races were, if you had just 10,000 votes to spread out in 5 different Senate races, the Democrats would have kept the majority in the Senate of 3.
Whoa, that is tight.
That is very tight. And I stress it because the Republicans now had a majority. They controlled committees. And Henry Cabot Lodge is going to chair the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And they can say that, he's in a parliamentary system, he would be repudiated, and those kinds
Right,
of things.
right. Yeah.
So it undermined his authority to some extent. And his compatriots at the Paris Peace Conference knew this, and they used it in certain situations.
So I want to jump back to Versailles and that Paris Peace
sure.
Conference. In what ways did the Treaty of Versailles live up to or fall short of Wilson's ideals?
Well, it depends on who you talk to about it. It's a mixed bag. It really is. Some historians would argue that it puts too much responsibility on the treaty itself for what happened later, when the British and the French might have done something to enforce it during the crisis over the Rhineland, for instance.
Sure. Yeah.
In the 1930s, that kind of thing. It certainly probably fell between 2 stools. It was harsh enough on Germany to cause a lot of resentment in German political society, but not strong enough to keep it down forever. That was never going to happen. And the other thing, you had to have a economically resurgent Germany in order to have an economically stable Western Europe as well. The ideas that came out of the 14 points, setting aside the treaty momentarily, were all progressive ideas, the ones that weren't territorial goals, like anti-imperialism. Wilson certainly had some blind spots there, but he let the genie out of the bottle, and there was no putting it back after 1919. And the combination of Wilson's rhetoric and Franklin Roosevelt's later on was irresistible for all the countries that were part of the French Empire and the British Empire and the Dutch Empire. They didn't get self-determination at the end of World War I, but they're definitely going to get in World War II.
Yeah.
If you see, and those are things that were set in motion in a positive way, anyhow.
Yeah.
Not necessarily by the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles is, not a good peace in the end. And the problem with it, though, is that without American ratification, it would never work.
Right.
The League of Nations portion of it.
Yeah.
How can it work properly without the most important member as a potential member, as a charter member of the League?
And let's talk more about that, about the United States not getting on board. This was one of the things that Wilson was able to get from the peace negotiations, but he went home with it and he couldn't get the Republicans to sign off. They wanted these reservations that he just refused to allow. Why wouldn't he compromise? Why wouldn't he accept the reservations to get the treaty ratified?
Well, an awful lot of the reservations went to the heart of the League. They called into question the concept of collective security, whether or not the United States would participate in some kind of coercive economic or military move to compel a warring nation to stand down. They would affect the arbitration provisions of the League, because those are basically compulsory. And, as I said before, Wilson's critics, very few of them were out and out isolationists. They were conservative internationalists. They thought the U.S. should join some kind of international organization, but it should be fully master of its own house. That it should build up its armed forces and jealously reserve the right to intervene militarily, unilaterally, without consulting the League. And Wilson's thought was that the United States had to accept the risk of losing in court
Yeah.
in order to make the League work properly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you went in under terms of your own choosing, you were going to undermine it from the very start. And that the United States simply had to recognize for this to work, that the United States had to accept certain responsibilities and constraints. All the great powers had to do that. So he's talking about multilateral things, whereas an awful lot of the conservative internationalists, certainly most of the Republican internationalists, um, uh, thought that this was an assault on American sovereignty, and in many respects, those were the shoals upon which the League of Nations foundered, as far as American ratification went. That you couldn't have arms reductions if you weren't agreeing to go along with what the League came to collectively. The same with the sanctions and those things. And actually, Wilson put a much heavier stress on today what we'd call conflict resolution, that is, on this crucial machinery for avoiding war before it started and for facilitating disarmament and settling international disputes peacefully through the process of arbitration. And his critics just thought he was willing to consign too many national interests to the will of an international authority. The Democratic leader Gilbert Hitchcock in the Senate uttered this phrase: "Internationalism has come, and we must decide what form the internationalism is to take." And no one ever summed it up better than that, really. That's what this was about competing forms of internationalism.
So, one thing I'd like to drill a little deeper on, and please correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding of the reservations is that they wouldn't have actually affected the League of Nations, that they were kind of just writing that said, we don't like this, but whatever, we're signing the treaty. Is that correct, or do I have that wrong? And if it
Well,
is correct, why wouldn't he just let that happen?
the League was in the treaty. You couldn't dissect it.
Sure.
You could not
Right.
remove it from the treaty.
Yeah.
And so the reservations were to say, okay, we'll go along with it except for this and except for that. And
So, did they
on.
actually have the holding to say, like, we're not going to do that? Or are they just paper, like,
Well,
we don't want to
what
do
do you
that, but
do
we
about a
will?
treaty? Do you renegotiate it, or what?
Yeah,
Because
I'm just confused on the reservations, like the function of them. Like, I thought I'd read that a reservation is where you say, I don't like that, but I'm still going to do it. I just think it's dumb. Was I wrong on that?
well, the way Lodge put it was this: that the reservations would, quote, release us from obligations that might not be kept, while
Interesting.
preserving rights which ought not to be infringed. And Wilson simply held that the reservations would change the entire meaning of the treaty and the League would be undermined from the start if it went in only, if the United States went in only on conditions of its own choosing. And so that was pretty much it. And ratification thus foundered. There were 3 votes on ratification, one with so there were 14 reservations, incidentally, curiously enough. You can count them,
Yeah.
but it were never able to muster the necessary 2/3 majority
Yeah.
uh, with or without the reservations.
Interesting.
And on the final one, that was, I guess it was in March of 1920. It failed just 7 votes short of ratification with the reservations.
Thank you for
And,
clearing that up for me.
yeah, yeah. Well, I don't know how clear I made it, but in any case, you also have the factor of Wilson's stroke in there
Yeah.
as well. Some people argue that there would have been a better outcome if he hadn't had the stroke. There's no guarantee of that. That does the stroke thesis. It's important certainly, but it does not tell you much about the politics of the League, which had their origins going back 1915, 1916, really.
Yeah.
They didn't just crop up in 1918 and 1919. And the midterm elections of 1918 completely changed the political environment in which the League would have had to have operated. Wilson lost a lot of his progressive following that kept him in office for a second term because of his acquiescence in the suppression of civil liberties during the war. So he didn't have the kind of, he was unable to keep that coalition of 1916 together that might have otherwise sustained him. And you needed the optimal political conditions in
Yeah.
American politics to sustain this as well. The covenant was partly like a constitution. You'd have to it was subject to interpretation. You're right to probe it that way, but if you're going to go in only on terms of your own choosing and these conservative terms, it's going to be something else. It will be a League of Nations much different than the progressive one that Woodrow Wilson um, thought he had in mind here.
So today we have a United Nations, which was inspired by the League of Nations, and the United States is part of it now. And yet we still also have war and suffering. So, what is the legacy of Wilson's pursuit of a new world order? Is what he wanted to create, is what he aspired for, is that possible?
Well, I don't know. The United States, Wilson was a little bit more popular in World War II than he was in World War One, because during World War II, the wisdom developed that if the United States had joined the League and paid more attention to Wilson, perhaps World War II might have been averted.
Yeah.
From 1943 onward, 44, during the war, you couldn't pick up a magazine that didn't have a photograph of Wilson or something about, the great betrayal, the fact that the U.S. didn't join the League, and now it had a second chance,
Yeah.
ideology. Even Hollywood got involved in it. Daryl Zanuck at 20th Century Fox produced a 2.5 hour Technicolor epic about Woodrow Wilson.
Wow.
And the last half hour, it came out in 1944, and it was made partly as pro-UN propaganda, actually, based on this idea of the second chance. But Franklin Roosevelt made sure that the basic Republican reservations, going back to 1919, were more or less in the United Nations
Yeah.
Charter.
Yeah.
And the United States, many times throughout the Cold War, violated various articles of the UN by going in unilaterally, overthrowing fledgling democracies in Guatemala or Iran or Vietnam itself. That was not a United Nations operation. J. William Fulbright once made the remark that Wilson came up, internationalism was the one great new idea of the 20th century in the field of international relations, the idea of international organization with permanent processes for the peaceful settlement of international disputes. And that challenge is still with us. In a lot of ways, the United States pursued a kind of anti-Wilsonian internationalist foreign policy. I'll tell you, in a way, conservative internationalism is what won out. A
After
kind
World
of
War One.
after World War II.
After World War Two. Okay.
Yes, yes, and more recently, of course, we've had Donald Trump, who is probably the least internationalist of all presidents, although George W. Bush, refused to ratify the Paris Climate Accords and the landmine treaties and those kinds of things. I think what is Wilsonian, for instance, if Wilson were active today, if he were president in the wake of Trump, let's say, I think that he would do everything in his power to get the Joint Comprehensive Plan on Iran's nuclear weapons back up and running. He would see to the implementation of the Paris Climate Accords, probably the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He would certainly advocate U.S. financial contributions, more of them to the UN, particularly for its peacekeeping activities. And above all, I'm certain he would see nuclear proliferation and global warming as the two gravest concerns that face the United States. And it's beyond the power and wisdom of just one country to deal with existential problems like this. And so I think in a lot of ways, Wilson's ideas are more important today than they ever were for those reasons. And NATO, for
Yeah.
instance, think about that as a small League of Nations kind of thing.
Yeah.
And
Sure.
the way Trump was, began denigrating NATO, wanted to pull out of it, and those kinds of things. He's we probably shouldn't get off on that tack. In any case, I think that's really seriously part of a very important legacy of
Yeah.
Wilsonian ideas that most Americans really aren't aware of, and how important international cooperation is today, more so than ever, because we are now at the point where the fate of the earth and humankind hang in the balance in so many respects.
I hope we figure this whole thing out at some point.
Well,
The last question I'd love to ask you. Oh, I'm sorry. Were you able to speak?
well, at one time, I forget, it was a senator from Arizona, I think, was in the Oval Office talking to Wilson during the armistice negotiations, and urging him to hang tough on him or something like that. And he said to him, "Can't people see that I'm struggling for? I'm thinking of 100 years hence."
Hmm.
And it's interesting to think about that. He was, the way he phrased it was, "I'm playing for 100 years hence."
Yeah. Yeah.
And those hundred years, really, they've run out now.
Yeah.
And the time we might have left might be shorter than we think to pull these things together to get on a different track
Yeah.
than we've been on in this decade.
And I think this last question is a timely one, given what we are just talking about, is to make these things happen, you need leadership to make this stuff happen. So what lessons in leadership can we learn from Wilson's experience chasing his dream?
Well, it depends on what you mean by leadership, and it's not just on the foreign policy side. It's on the domestic side of things. He and FDR and Lyndon Johnson are the most effective domestic leaders we've ever had in terms of getting legislation through. Maybe Johnson, in a way, the most, because he realized that when you're elected, you got 2 years to get done what you're going to get done,
Yeah.
and that's sort
And
of
then
the
those
way it
midterms
worked
are
out,
coming.
that sort of thing.
Yeah.
The other thing is presidents have very little control of what hand they're dealt. I
Yeah.
think President Biden has one of the toughest hands dealt to him of any president since Jimmy Carter or maybe Herbert Hoover. And I would have said that before, the Russians invaded the Ukraine. This has just made it all the more difficult. So you definitely have to be some sort of student of history, I would think, and realize that this is one world, as Wendell Willkie, another progressive internationalist of a Republican sort in the early 1940s, said. We live in one world, and we all have to get along and do our best to help everybody survive and prosper. We could use, in certain respects, parts of another Wilson and parts of another Lyndon Johnson and FDR and Barack Obama. I think in foreign affairs, I think Joe Biden is doing a very good job in terms of dealing with the war. And it's rather Wilsonian, the way
Yeah.
he's pulling together
Yeah. Good point.
a Wilsonian internationalist coalition to check the Russians ultimately.
Yeah, I think it's interesting the way you say you want parts of Wilson, because there's certainly some parts. Not we'll talk to other historians about the parts you don't want, but you just want like a scalpel to just take the good stuff, and the good stuff's really good.
Lyndon Johnson's half a great president.
Yeah, that's what we need. We need that the best halves of everybody.
Wilson set the destination. We're not there.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. If you'd like to hear more from Tom, please check out To End All Wars, Woodrow Wilson and the Quest for a New World Order, or his other works, such as The Rise of a Prairie Statesman, The Life and Times of George McGovern. He's also contributed to the Woodrow Wilson episode of PBS's American Experience. I love that program. Thank you so much for your time, Tom.
Thank you, Kenny. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Abridged Presidential Histories. The music in today's podcast is a public domain recording of the United States Army Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps. You can follow the show on Facebook at Abridged Presidential Histories or on Twitter at APH Podcast. You guys and gals listening are the reason I get excited to work on the show. I appreciate you lending me your ears and your time. If you have any friends or family who you think would enjoy it, just drop in that recommendation next time you're talking to them. You know, a little, hi, how's it going? Nice weather today. You should totally listen to this podcast. Real smooth and natural. In our next episode, I'll talk to Paul Brandis, a longtime member of the White House Press Corps and author of several books on the presidency about Woodrow Wilson's wives and the important roles they played during his presidency. That's next time on Abridged Presidential Histories.